2026? Is it going to spur the changes we all hope, not just for us humans, but every other animal and ecosystem on the planet, as many landmark reports have screamed at us, rightly so, this year? Time is very, very short. So now, before we delve into what we expect to emerge from what is the biggest climate-related gathering in the world, kicking off in Glasgow this Sunday, it's very, very timely, I'd like each of the speakers to give their opinion on the list of stories which will be showing up shortly on the screen. So firstly, thank you to all of you for joining us. Tim, we'd like to kick us off. Tim Buckley, Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, which of course we also know as the IEFA.
Thanks, Michelle. Hopefully I'm coming through clear.
Yes, all good, thank you.
I was going to go with the next 1,000 unicorns to come from the green tech sector. I mean, Larry Fink, and you might be aware we've had a very much love-hate relationship with BlackRock over the last 3 years. 3 years ago, we had a very detailed discussion with Larry Fink. He made it absolutely clear BlackRock had no fiduciary duty, no moral duty to act on the science, and it was up to the investors. 6 months later, his letter came out. I think a year later, he actually meant it, and now he's a bigger evangelist about the clean tech investment opportunities than anyone I speak to in the world, and it's brilliant to hear. I actually disagree with the statement. I am a little more cautious than he is on that. I think there is going to be trillions and tens of trillions invested over the next couple of decades, but I would very much distinguish that clean tech is very different to the internet. There is not the intellectual property, there is not the massive moat around internet companies that you see in the renewables sector, and renewables are all about massive ongoing deflation. But I love his passion, and at the end of the day, when a $10 trillion fund talks, or the CEO, we've got to listen. It's great to see Larry Fink could be working for IEFA.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. And next up, Ian Munro, Strategy Director at Rice Energy. Hi, Ian.
Hi. I mean, I was actually going to pick that one as well. I think it's the most interesting out of all of them. I think it sends a signal to the market that there's a lot to do, but there's a lot of opportunity in that sector. And Rise is a clean tech company. Goodness, I'd love to be a unicorn, but it does show that there has to be scale in the climate tech, green tech sector for us to achieve our goals in terms of carbon neutrality. So I do feel like that's a signal that, as was said, Larry Fink has gone a complete 180, and so has the company in terms of how they're investing, and so I feel like it's more of a market mover and a signal for change than perhaps I would agree with Tim that there's not going to be 1,000 of them, but it's definitely an interesting thing to say a couple of days before COP26.
Well, yeah, of course, the timing being very intentional, and we touch again on that word, the S word, the scale word, which we're going to go into a bit today as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts more on that, because it's this word that just keeps revolving. Whenever we talk about clean tech, it just revolves around it, very understandably. Next up, Sebastian Fuchs, founding partner of Bloom Sustainable Advisors. Thank you very much, Seb, for joining us today.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. I actually was going to talk to the Larry Fink point as well, mostly because of my background in finance, and just seeing how typically the issue isn't cash, the issue is bankable, viable opportunities. But I had a backup, which was shipping. So I'm going to talk a little bit about shipping. Since the founding of the Kyoto Protocol, shipping has had an obligation to come up with a plan, and it's been a long time since Kyoto was enacted in 1997. It's been interesting to see that in aviation, serious steps have been taken forwards, and we've now got the emergence of CORSIA, which at least begins to price the cost of pollution. But it's encouraging to see that the IMO is coming to the table and thinking more strategically now around how can they decarbonize. And we've seen many private sector players in the shipping space push independently forwards, either with net zero targets or just generally with sort of a decarbonization agenda without specific targets in mind. And you know, what's emerging is that I think we're still waiting for technological changes and essentially commercial innovation to actually drive further decarbonization in shipping. And so I think it's really interesting to create a cost for CO2 that potentially could then fund further innovation for the sector. And I'm not necessarily one who is a big proponent of taxes, but in this case, I think it might actually be a worthwhile path to follow.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something else I'd like to go into, is putting a price on carbon in whatever form that may be, explored more deeply at COP26. And also, I think it's very interesting on the shipping side to see exactly everything you said in terms of it's often been bunched alongside aviation historically, and they've been these two naughty kids in the playground that haven't quite bucked up as quickly as they needed to, and then aviation has stepped up a lot more. Still, it has a huge way to go. We talk about SAFs as if they're already in in flowing production, and we're already flying aircraft casually with them, and of course that's certainly not the case, but they are making bigger steps forward. And with shipping, I've always thought it's going to be interesting to see the reaction to IMO 2020 was huge from the shipping sector. We're quite involved in that in the Middle East in terms of it being a bunkering hub, of course. And there was a lot of stress, a lot of strain, a lot of panic, even though, of course, we had a bit of notice. There was 2 to 3 years notice that, well, we always knew it was going to happen, and then those involved had a couple of years notice that it would probably be happening 2020, 25, and there was still this big reaction to it as well. So the idea of firmer targets, the idea of having to invest greater funds into it and so on, it'd be interesting to see how the market reacts, especially after the pandemic. So thank you very much for that. I think we're going to dive into the main bulk, and all of you have done a great job of touching on key points that we're going to go into anyway. So I'm really keen to get an idea from you, Tim, in terms of the level of ambition that's been set going into COP26. So this year, we've seen 20% of the world's largest corporates with sales worth $14 trillion committed to net zero. So according to the ECIU and Oxford Net Zero. And most recently in this region, we've seen the UAE, which is OPEC's third biggest producer, commit to net zero. We thought it was probably going to happen just before COP, and it's all played out. But for energy companies, what sort of tone does this set in terms of ambition for COP26? Tim?
Yeah, I think, and I'll add to the list of momentum, and the momentum has just been staggering in the last 3-6 months. But I mean, I don't know whether I'd want to talk about N+1 from China this week, which to me is an absolute world changer, or whether I talk about the fact that the UN Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero and 1.5 degrees has probably now exceeded $100 trillion of pledged capital, pledging not to Paris, not to 2 degrees, but to 1.5 degrees with 2030 interim targets and annual transparency. Now, you could argue that it's greenwash, but at the same time, the US Treasury and the SEC are now looking to bring in very key guidance to say you must be true to label, as Europe's seen over the last couple of years. When the SEC speaks, the US finance industry will implement that. And so I would not want to bet against $100 trillion of global capital that is committing to 1.5 degrees. Now, I'm sure most of them have no idea how they're going to deliver on it, but the reality is if they spend a couple of years working that out, the weight of money is unstoppable. And at the end of the day, 30 years in finance says don't bet against $100 trillion, you will lose.
So from your point of view, very ambitious tone, do you think that it's going to pay off? How optimistic are you?
I think it already has, but I mean, the number of changes that are coming through, COP's going to be the catalyst. It'll be the ongoing discussions all the way up to it, into it, and then after it. But I mean, even today, we've seen the Democrats in America talk about a $1,500 a ton price fee, sorry, not even a tax, it's just a straight fee on methane. That in its own right, one little initiative, and that could be a game changer to the oil and gas industry globally. And it could actually be a climate game changer because it'll force action that has to happen, and it'll force it at accelerated levels. So I'm really bullish. I think the momentum is unstoppable.
And it's also great to see more being done on methane. Ian, for you, how do you feel about COP26? My experience has been over the last 15 years that there's a lot of excitement. Now, this is obviously not going to be like that, but there's a lot of excitement in advance, a lot of hope. Seb may agree with me on this. We've known each other nearly 15 years, so perhaps you'll agree with me that there'll be a lot of excitement, a lot of hope, and then it doesn't quite hit the mark. And the ones I've attended, there seems to be this pervading sense of doom and disappointment, and it just grows as the weeks roll on. But I feel this is going to be very different. Am I being overly optimistic? What do you think, Ian?
I think there's going to be, as Tim said, the preamble and the stage is set. There's been a lot of commitments made. Saudi Arabia, committing to net zero by 2060, I think is a real game changer as well, for the oil and gas majors, because it sets a precedent. But I think, as you said, I'm more about action and implementation than, this is a great platform for everyone to make commitments, and it's the commitments that, it's the plan that supersedes the commitment that we need to see, and we need to see that action. And look, it's a long road. This is 30 years in the making, but we need to, there are 4 key agendas for COP, and we need to sort of hit all of those and have a plan of action leading into the next COP, and in terms of reaching that 1.5 goal, great. How do we do it? It's exactly what Tim said. Everyone can commit the capital. So we've got the capital commitments. How do we roll out that plan? How do we electrify the unelectrified? Not using dirty diesel, things like that. Which is going to be a massive challenge, because everybody's going to want to get online. So how do we do that, and is it whose responsibility is that? So there's a lot to do. Proof's going to be in the pudding. I'm excited to go. I haven't been before, so it'll be interesting to see what the atmosphere is like. It seems like the public is a lot more engaged than before, which is great. And over the past couple of years, I think that's really just come to the forefront with everything else that's been going on in terms of societal changes, environmental changes, and it's now coming into corporate and governmental implementation.
Thanks, Ian. And it is very exciting being up there. And my main non-climate takeaway would be that every plug socket is taken up with somebody charging their mobile phone or their laptop, and people scrabbling on the floor trying to find enough charge. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens this time as well. Seb, Ian just mentioned there the proof in the pudding, and I'd add to that the devil's in the detail. Tim also said, they've got this huge financing, don't know how we're going to work it out yet, but that's the next phase. How much detail can we actually expect from COP? It's a very short time period to be thinking we can get a detailed roadmap on this or a detailed roadmap on that, and that would be unrealistic to a large degree. But in terms of the points that you think detail can be achieved on, for example, carbon pricing, do you think that there's enough progress right now? We've got 64 carbon pricing initiatives worldwide versus 2 in 1990, so that's progress. We've seen progress with CBAM as well, record high prices on cap and trade. Things are certainly picking up. Do you think now is finally the time that we will see more of a global agreement, not a global carbon price, but a global agreement on carbon pricing at COP?
It's such an interesting point, Michelle, and I think for some of us who have been, let's call us first generation carbon traders or climate change policy, warriors, I still think there's a little hangover from the Kyoto Protocol and the ambition of the CDM and joint implementation that I think always leads us down the path of, as you rightly said, like a potential global carbon price, or at least like indirect linking of markets. through some sort of fungible instrument recognized at a UN level. And, you know, Article 6 definitely highlights the potential for that. But the policy work that has to go into kind of creating more definition, I think that's going to rumble on for some time. And I think what's different this time it's kind of forced me to draw a line between today and Kyoto, is that there are so many regional schemes now that are emerging. So, you know, in the old days, we used to talk about carbon credits or allowances or offsets. But I think now, actually we're going to enter the year or the decade of the carbon accountant. I think that the need for an actual financial instrument is actually probably going to evolve, and actually the power to recognize reductions on a corporate balance sheet will actually probably sit with the PwC and KPMGs of the world. But I think that the need for carbon pricing now actually is to actually stimulate innovation. I think, you know, if a corporate is willing to pay $20 or $50 a ton for offsets, and I think essentially they should consider that to be their internal carbon price. And that should then be used as a lever to drive internal innovation. You know, what I've been really interested in this week, and it's good to have an Australian on the line as well, is that the proposed target of Australia has been sort of communicated in a very Australian way. And of course, the rest of the world has reacted in the way the rest of the world tends to react to Australia when it sort of talks about its plans whilst, you know, digging out coal. But actually, I think that they're kind of taking an approach which is different from everyone else, and they call it a very Australian approach, but they're kind of saying we're going to rely on technology and innovation. And I think that there is something to that. I think it kind of recognizes, along with the banks and all the trillions of dollars stacked up, ready to do something, ready to take action. I think they recognize we don't actually know what the answer is. We don't know where the innovation is going to come from. We know that we can stimulate it. We know that we can provide funding to sort of de-risk some of those innovations to a degree. And we know that we've got these monster pension funds that can buy into long-term projects. So we can take 20-year risk or 50-year risk if the project's big enough and viable enough. But actually, I think that they're being relatively honest with the rest of the world, which is we don't know how this is going to happen. And in light of the fact we don't have like a global price for carbon yet, we're going to rely on local and regional initiatives to make the most of what we can.
Thank you, Seb. You touched on so many points there that we just don't have time to go into more depth, that my mind is pinging, and I'd love to delve into them a lot more. But the one I'll pick up on the most and just ask Tim about, as an Australian, of course, is the innovation, the investment and innovation focus. And we saw in the IPCC report recently that was a key message coming through: invest, innovate. And these aren't brand new messages, but the ecosystems to try and get them off the ground fully. We all know the figures when it comes to the level of clean tech we have versus the level of innovation that we still need as well. Do you agree with that side of things, Tim?
I wouldn't agree with anything that our Prime Minister or federal government says, because they don't actually know or believe in anything that they're talking about. They're full of marketing spin, and there is no detail to the plan. But let's answer it in a positive. I think that let's go back to what we all agreed on. And what Larry Fink's talking about is this huge wall of capital that's coming that is going to spur innovation, that is going to spur technology development, and then we're going to see it embraced at the multi-trillion-dollar level with the degree of urgency that we needed 5-10 years ago, but no better time than today to start, and it's going to happen. So yes, I'm expecting enormous innovation, and probably, let me just touch on two announcements. We saw ITM Power of the UK announce that they were raising £250 million or euros in order to expand their capacity of electrolyzers up to 5 gigawatts. Now, the biggest plant they operated was 100 megawatts today. So you're just talking a 50-fold expansion in capacity. And then on the other side of the world, Twiggy Fortescue announces they're building a 2 gigawatt facility. Now, we know Reliance is going to do the same in India, and we know The ThyssenKrupp in Germany is doing the same. So the amount of electrolyzer capacity is not going to grow by 10, 20, 100%. It's going to grow by 50-fold in the space of a couple of years. So the deflation we've seen in solar that the market's now really got their mind around, we've seen it in batteries, we're seeing it in electric vehicles, we're going to see it in green hydrogen. Who knows if green hydrogen will work or whether we just electrify everything. I think that's probably the bigger option. And I think Ian touched on that. In Australia, we're talking about electrify everything. And that's going to be the game changer. But it's the wall of capital that's coming and the scale that will be unprecedented. And we see that. And that's why I love India, the ability to deploy literally $50-100 billion a year in renewable energy is entirely probable, in my view, in the next couple of years, and that'll have been brought forward by the rampant fossil fuel inflation. So coal companies, oil companies, all making good money right now today, but the buyer, India, the buyer, China, the buyer, Vietnam, has to deal with rampant inflation. The best protection against that is domestic renewable infrastructure investment. So I'm expecting India to double, treble their investment in the next 2 years.
India is a fascinating story. We could sit here for the next 3 hours just talking about that. It's emerging into a league of its own. But yes, I agree. It's certainly it's very, very intriguing. Ian, just to talk about the volume, you spoke about those 1,000 unicorns in the very beginning, and I mentioned about that big S word, the importance of scale. And I'd be keen to hear from you if you think that there's a risk of moving in the wrong direction. So some of the companies we speak to say that they're confused, say that there's so much going on that they just don't really know which way to move. They're under pressure on the ESG point of view. They're under pressure from their customers on the ground. They're under pressure from digital and ink headlines. Must do something, but not, deer in headlights almost, brand new to this sort of thing, and not really sure which way to head. And we're seeing big intimidating figures, the OECD saying $6.9 trillion US dollars worth of investments a year for the next 15 years are required in clean energy infrastructure and technology to just keep to 2 degrees, not even the 1.5. Do you think, Ian, that there needs to be a lot more data clarity, a lot more guidance, a lot more oversight when it comes to boosting transparency and what's needed, good routes to follow and so on? Do you think that's needed to avoid expensive backtracking later on?
I think it's becoming easier and easier for countries and companies to decarbonize, and I think that there's always been this battle, or there was this battle about the technology deployment. How are we to do it? Are we to solarize ourselves? It's becoming easier and easier to make sure that we can deploy solar, let the experts do their part in terms of the energy suppliers. And the energy efficiencies are there's consultancies worldwide now that are doing this. So I think there was a mist and it's lifting. But I think now more than ever, it's very much about bringing someone on board, a trusted partner, and then forming a sustainability strategy. And with utility suppliers, or self-generation, it's very easy to go green. And from there, then you set yourself up for success. So I think it's, there's a lot of talk, and I do think, there might be a bit of demystifying, but really it's quite a simple task nowadays with the amount of support and infrastructure there is around, and that not necessarily that you need to be investing as a company. I mean, there are developers that will do that for you, so it's not, they'll supply the electricity, they'll supply the green energy. There is some element of greenwashing that goes on, but that it really is about just making those forward steps. And I think if everyone continues to do that, then we're only going to continue to get closer to reaching our goals.
I think at the moment, sometimes those comments are being used more and more as excuses. Like you say, the enabling factors are certainly there, and there are companies doing these one-stop shop offerings really, and are very valuable in doing so. Seb, what do you find this is happening in your space?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you know, in the context right now of higher inflation and certainly higher energy prices globally, I think that the argument around whether things are greenwashing or not, at least for now, is not actually the most important argument. Right now, let's talk about energy resilience. Let's recognize the value of long-term clean energy as being an asset on our balance sheet and a way of mitigating, you know, volatility in OPEX costs. Like if we really have to drill down to it with a CFO, that's where we can go to. But it's really interesting. Ian's point on collaboration, I think, is really key to this. Like you no longer have to invest in your own LED light bulbs. There are so many companies that will finance the entire package and give you a long-term energy services agreement. If you look at Norsk Hydro, you know, they're going to be building one of the first hydrogen plants for heavy industry in Northern Europe. And they're doing co-development. And now they're at the stage where the development is at a stage where it needs to be commercialized. And they're now going to sell that as an off-balance sheet project and essentially just become the off-taker of clean energy for the purposes of producing aluminium. So I think, going back to Larry Fink, you know, we're actually using all the same tools that we've always used to finance innovation and to finance technology. They're just going to be used in a slightly different way. And I think the CEOs of the world and leaders are recognizing that actually, you know, this is an effort, but perhaps it's not that bigger effort than they first thought. And actually, perhaps this is more important than they first realized as well, for more than just decarbonization.
I think just to add one point on that is the evolution of business models as well. We're a technology company. We manufacture small wind turbines and provide hybrid systems. Now, we originally were a technology supplier solely, and as we've evolved into different sectors, we've had to adapt to different business models. So in the telecom sector, if you're dealing with a tower company and they want to decarbonize their assets, they want to purchase the technologies because they want that on the balance sheet. Whereas if you're speaking to an MNO, the network operator, they do not want that on their balance sheet. They just want their technology. So we provide it as a service. And so all of a sudden you get into renewables as a service, power as a service, you're doing cost per electricity, you're doing fixed costs per month. And, you know, just a few years ago, we were just selling the tech. And so the development of the business models in small scale renewables as well, it's just that ability to let the customer, whether that's an industrial client that wants to solarize his rooftop and decarbonize or mitigate against price increases or the price of diesel, it's just about that. Well, okay, if that's going to be an issue to you, we know the benefits of it, so allow us to do that for you.
Indeed, it's essentially maturing and evolving and becoming a lot more relevant and being under that pressure as well from external factors that we touched on earlier. Incredibly, we're nearly out of time, and I say that because there are so many things I still want to chat about, from the developing nation gap, offsets. Seb mentioned that. I wanted to dive into how that's going to feed into everything, and I had more questions as well on the technology side. So the fact that it's gone so fast is certainly a good sign, and we've covered a lot. But we are going to just go a few minutes over if all of you are fine to be online, because I'd like to really get your views on what are, if you know, on your wish list, what would you hope comes out of COP? So individually, just a short summary. If you had your choice completely, and going back to unicorns, what would you like to see come out of COP, Tim?
Maybe going back to Seb's point, I mean, I don't think there is any hope for a global carbon price in the short term, but increased regional cooperation, increased acceptance of it, and whether it's as simple as a methane tax or a carbon price or regional, I mean, even the Australian government did actually reference in the Quad, we will develop international carbon trading. So to me, let's put a price on the big externality and let the market solve for that. You need a price on it, and that's why Europe's moving fastest. They've got a very clear price.
Indeed. Thank you. Ian?
For me, it's electrifying the unelectrified. So whilst there's been, I can't even, Tim, I've forgotten your number, was it 100 trillion committed? There's 200 billion that's needed in electrifying the unelectrified. So energy access for those is going to be critical, and the displacement of diesel and moving towards clean energies is, I think, one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. There's still 1 billion without access to either electricity or reliable electricity on the planet, which is 1 in 7. So, you know, we need to address that issue. It's a big elephant in the room.
No, it really is, and it doesn't pop up as much as I think many of us would like, and that's something I want to go into with the developed and developing nation side of things. Not talking just about you know, energy deployment, but the financial architecture that can start really making a big difference in getting those funds that are being raised, albeit belatedly, as we saw on our top 10 list, getting them A, increased, and B, deployed far faster. But yes, that's a whole nother conversation as well. Thanks very much, Ian, for that. And Seb, what about for you? What's on your wish list?
So for all the talk of innovation in financial markets and 100 trillion, you know, the one thing that investors really detest is uncertainty. They want predictability, and they want clear signals to enable them to invest. So this might sound a bit sweeping, but I just want there to be a bit more certainty from the announcements that come out at the end of COP to sort of hopefully highlight coherence. Like, I'm not expecting a carbon price,
No.
but I would like to see greater alignment between major parties to enable us then to actually talk to investors and say, okay, well, we can now run this capital.
I mean, if that happens in 2 weeks, that's great. That would be significant progress, indeed. So we've covered quite a bit. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. The unicorn certainly stole the day on the list of news, thanks to Larry. And we've talked about different countries' progress, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Australia, all with different tones, all different expectations of what will rise there. We've also talked about the importance of collaboration, evolving business models, the need for a lot more progress when it comes to firmer, deeper pricing mechanisms for carbon, and then also the fact that there's fewer excuses for people to get involved. The systems are there to help those who say we just don't know where to turn. Well, they, you know, perhaps it's innocent, but also it could just be resident excuses. This, you know, there are lots of helpers out there. So we've covered a lot in just 30 minutes, and we didn't even get to do the survey questions. There's just so much more that I would have loved to have chatted to you all about. So Ian, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim and Seb, and I hope you can all join us again soon.
Thank you.